You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Ed Friedman has lived near Merrymeeting Bay for over 35 years, where he operates helicopter welding, kayaking, and farming businesses. His broad-based background in the natural sciences includes over 45 years as an outdoor educator, some of that as a mountaineering instructor for the National Outdoor Leadership School. Ed has a BS in environmental science from Southern University of New York, with course and fieldwork in wildlife ecology, glacial geology, hydrology, remote sensing, plant ecology, and snow morphology, to name a few. Ed has been on the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay steering committee since 1993 and became chair in 1996. Today we start with Ed describing the wonderful Merrymeeting Bay and the issues that his organization is working on now.
Merrymeeting Bay is located at the confluence of 6 rivers in kind of the southern mid-coastal area of Maine. We drain almost 40% of Maine and part of New Hampshire through down into the bay, and then exiting through a 200-meter bedrock slot and on down about 17 miles to the Atlantic Ocean via the Kennebec River. So we have the 2 major rivers that come in and meet at the bay are the Kennebec and the Androscoggin rivers. The Androscoggin was actually a poster child for Senator Edmund Muskie's Clean Water Act and is still considered a second-class river here, unfortunately. And then there's 4 smaller rivers. So technically the bay is an estuary. We get a little bit of salt in once in a great while. Salt content is like 2 or 3 parts per thousand. The ocean is 35 parts per thousand. So all our vegetation is freshwater vegetation. Biologists consider it to be tidal riverine, all these rivers, and there is a tide in here. And then geologically it's an inland delta. So at low tide, picture all of this 40% of Maine's water going out through this little slot, which is called the Chops. And on down, it's fresh water, obviously. At high tide, there's about 17 miles or so for the salt to come up the river. There's a couple of narrows below the Chops as well, retards the flow. Meanwhile, all this river water is trying to get out, and it's essentially the river water backing up against the tide that makes this freshwater tidal. And it's tidal, in fact, another about 25 miles upstream to Augusta, the capital of Maine. And so in the summer, a lot of our flats out here, mud flats, so they're all bare to start with. When the ice goes out, the bay freezes in the winter. I was skiing on it a few days ago. In the summer, we'll have a lot of wild rice growing here and other vegetation. And the bay is considered the largest staging ground for migratory waterfowl north of Chesapeake Bay. It is the second hottest spot for bald eagle recovery in the state of Maine, first being Cobscook Bay, which is right on the Canadian border. It's home to a couple of dozen rare plants that live in our intertidal zone, some of which are globally rare. And while there are other estuaries that have multiple rivers that come into them, they are generally linear in nature. Connecticut River, the Hudson River, not that those have multiple tribs coming in, but they're linear in nature. San Joaquin Delta is one. The Tigris, Euphrates, kind of come in together. The 2 main tributaries here, the Kennebec and the Andro, come in opposite ends of the bay, and then the whole bay is restrained by this constriction called the Chops. And then you got the other rivers as well. So it's kind of like a big soup bowl in here. And what we call the residence time, the time that the water or stuff in the water stays in here, can be quite long. The bay can be difficult to get out of. And that has major repercussions. If, for example, there's an oil spill somewhere, or there's a bunch of development on particularly a smaller tributary, a series of 50 underwater tidal generating windmills, 50-foot in diameter, right at the Chops, which they talked about doing a number of years ago. and striped bass larvae are just drifting in and out of that, so getting repeated exposures. So anyway, it's a very cool spot, surrounded by some of the best farmland in Maine, alluvial soil and parts of it. In the east here, Atlantic salmon, American shad, alewives, blueback herring, rainbow smelt. Those are striped bass. Those are some of the common anadromous migratory species. Anadromous being coming from the Greek to run up. So the fish that come up here into freshwater to spawn, then go back to the ocean. Two important types I didn't mention are two different kinds of sturgeon in the bay. And then we have one catadromous, the opposite, lives most of its life in freshwater, goes to sea to spawn once in its life, and that's the American eel.
If you are like me and you're a little bit more terrestrial and you haven't studied this part of the country, just opening up Merrymeeting Bay in Google Images will bring up an awful lot of stuff. And of course, going to friendsofmerrymeetingbay.org will pull up an awful lot of information to back up what Ed said. I fact-checked everything as he said it, and he's right about it all.
It is only hearsay, but you're hearing the right stuff.
Yes. One of the things that's really eerie is I think our director, John Davis, during his podcast, which was really early on when the podcast started, kind of threw a pitch at this very podcast today because he called for the American eel to be considered as a possible aquatic flagship species, a counterpart to the eastern cougar reintroduction. And here I am talking with somebody who knows a little bit about American eels. Can you tell everybody how that species factors in to the conservation efforts that you guys are interested in?
So the American eel just has an amazing life cycle. Probably a lot of people on the air or however you listen to podcasts, have heard of the Bermuda Triangle, kind of down there in the southwest Atlantic Ocean. And that's about where the Sargasso Sea is, named after the sargassum weed. It's a seaweed that's abundant there and provides a lot of cover, as vegetation usually does, whether terrestrial or aquatic, cover and feed for certain species. So American eels and European eels, which differ only by, I believe, one bone in their body. It's been a while since I read about this. Both actually are born in the Sargasso Sea. The European eels being kind of in the northern part, American eels being a little bit south. They're born from parents that, or from a female that dies after she spawns, and they spend about maybe a year or so drifting on the tides or the currents along the coast here. In this case, American eel up the East Coast, but really from Venezuela up to Labrador is their range. And they look like a little leaf, like a willow leaf, sort of an elongate, flat larval phase like that. And it is when they start to get a whiff of fresh water, and this is not necessarily the fresh water from whence their parents came, as most anadromous fish tend to return to where they were born. The eels do that, but that was the Sargasso Sea. So it's kind of a hit or miss as to which rivers they ascend into, but they metamorphose into the eel shape that we know of as they gain proximity to fresh water. And initially, their little eel bodies, which are maybe a couple inches long and maybe an eighth of an inch, or less across, are transparent, and these are called glass eels. And you can see their eye, you can see their heart, you can see their lungs. And that's kind of about it. And as they come into fresh water, they start to attain some pigment, and they start to color up a little bit and get so you can't see through them, and that's when they become known as elvers. Now, an important thing to know is that, with the exception of a couple of instances in a lab, basically eels have not been bred in captivity, not successfully really, or commercially certainly. And so when if you go to a Japanese restaurant and you get some eel, smoked eel, it's really good, and I won't eat it anymore. But that eel was caught as as an elver somewhere in the wild and raised on an eel farm or ranch somewhere. Typically in Spain, could have been in Asia. So the little elvers come upstream, and in Maine, they stand a good chance of getting whacked by elver fishermen using nets. South Carolina is the only other state that allows commercial harvest of elvers, but South Carolina has a minimum length of 6 inches. There is no minimum length in Maine. Maybe 2,500 elvers per pound, and they get about 2,500. The price can vary wildly, but last few years it's been $2,800 a pound. So you can imagine there's sort of a little bit of a Wild West elver fishery out here. And it's calmed down some, but in the old days there was people that got shot and stuff. There's, it's crazy. So that's one way that the eels get killed. So then they swim up the river. Their sex isn't determined at this point. The further up the watershed they get, those are the eels that turn to females, and they will be in the watershed for 20 to 50 years. And the females, which when they're sort of teenagers, they get known as yellow eels, and then as they get older, at some point they get really large and they're silvery colored, and they will then, on some rainy night in the fall, get the urge to outmigrate, and they're called silvers. So what happens to them then? Well, they are interesting critters in that we have all these obstructions on the streams, the rivers, and Maine has more hydroelectric dams than most other states. A lot of non-hydro dams as well, just sitting there, remnants of the old days when there were mechanical mills for different purposes. So eels can actually get out of the water and take in oxygen through their skin for a little bit. So in where a dam may obstruct a salmon, for example, or an alewife, it may be less successful obstructing an eel. But remember that if an eel does get out of the water and follow a slimy trail of its predecessor and kind of get around the dam, it's using a lot of energy to do that. It's exposing itself to mammal or avian predation, and it can just dry out. So it's not a good thing. So they live up here. They do their thing for years. They're scavengers. They eat anything. They're very fatty. So that's called hydrophilic, like fat. So they do attract fatty toxins, like dioxin or like PCBs, just as a bluefish would. And so then they get the urge to migrate, and they head downstream. And what happens? They hit a hydro dam with a bunch of turbines in it. And most of these don't have adequate protection on the upstream side to keep fish from going through the turbines, and they don't have adequate bypasses as an alternative route to go downstream on what we call their out migration, the same term for fish. So they get chopped up. Now we've not only just prevented that eel from spawning after, giving it its one chance after 50 years, but we've just cut up essentially a vacuum cleaner bag, if you will, that has successfully been sequestering some of our most severe toxins over the years, and is trying to leave with them so the eels can play an important role in cleaning up a river, which is not to say when they die that's probably any good for the Sargasso where they end up if they get there. But what we're doing when we have the turbine mortality is we're recycling all those toxins back into a relatively closed ecosystem here, in the inland waters of Maine, where the eels would have provided an important cleaning role for those waters. So, and I should mention, while I think of it, because my mind jumps around, that I mentioned Japanese restaurant, but the first Thanksgiving dinner, probably not turkey, probably eel.
Interesting.
Yeah, they're very fatty, right? So Indians could take the first settlers out there with a spear, and they're curled up in the mud, sort of hibernating for the winter. Spear them, and you get a lot of calories out of an eel, and it's probably easier to catch than running around after a turkey, who are wicked smart. So
You had to
eels,
work in a wicked smart there. I'm so glad to hear that.
yes, sir. It's just like us humans. We some clever, but we sure ain't very smart.
So hydroelectric dams, overfishing.
Yep.
How does all of this play into the eel is one thing, but our overarching goal here today was to hit on the topic of migratory fish restoration. What role does the eel play in that web or network of issues that are sure to be there? The other fish, the other things that you guys are concerned about is with the ecosystem as a whole.
Well, like a lot of these critters, particularly the smaller, more plentiful ones at the bottom of the food chain, and hopefully you will remind me if I forget to come back to diatoms.
Oh yes, I love diatoms
and plankton. When the eels do come up into the river, when they're that small, there are hundreds of thousands of them, right? And it's sort of like when alewives come up, it's a river herring, or leave, they're really a small fish. These guys are all pretty low on the maritime food chain and even getting into terrestrial food chains. So they serve important purposes for, you ring in the bell and dinner is served for somebody, right? So a great example is, when they're dams, they typically slow down the passage, if not make it impossible for any number of these species. So what will happen is, particularly because we're short of really large fish now, particularly when there are outgoing small fish, there will be often introduced species like a smallmouth bass or largemouth bass or pickerel, some of these critters hanging out, it could be a snapping turtle too, hanging out near the obstacle, right? It's hang out near the dam and food gets funneled into my mouth. So that happens with elvers when they're coming up. Larger fish know that dinner is being served. A remarkable example with one of the few successful fish restorations here, localized but successful, has been the restoration of river herring, which by that I mean the alewives and blueback herring, up in the Kennebec River and up into the tributary, comes into the Kennebec at Waterville, which is about 17 miles north of Augusta, site of the first successful removal of a working hydro dam in this country. There's a dam about 10 miles up to Sebasticook. It's got a fish lift, which is an elevator to move fish over it, migratory fish. And these are mostly moving herring. Well, the herring run has come back so well that last year they moved about 6 million fish over that dam. Now, when there gets to be that many fish in one spot, these are adults, again, someone's ringing the bell, and who's answering up here are the bald eagles and the osprey. And one of the things I do besides chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, I fly a helicopter commercially, and I do a lot of eagle nest surveys in the spring, and now it's into the summer a little bit. But one of the types of counts we do is called a flush count, where you can just fly up the river and see who flushes off a nest and count them. Normally we're counting chicks and so forth like that. We do a real nest survey, but if I fly up this 10-mile section on the Sebasticook up to the dam there, when the herring run is peaking, I have flown in the middle of about 70 bald eagles or so. And that's incredible. And normally around here, we see eagles fairly commonly now down here in the lower part of the river on the bay here, Merrymeeting Bay. But one of the things an eagle likes to do, which of course makes it a perfect national bird, is when it sees someone else with a fish in its talons, like an osprey, it goes and scares the bejesus out of them and attacks them, and the osprey drops the fish and the eagle steals it. So yay America. So up there, what's so cool is that there's so many alewives that the osprey and the eagle are fishing without harassing each other at all. There's food for everybody. And so, and what I say here kind of transfers to the elvers as well, or to any other plentiful small species. The those that profit from it, if you will, are not only the birds in this case, could be the bigger fish, could be the turtles, could be black bear, could be the raccoons, could be mink, could be weasels. And the connection may not even be a direct predator and prey connection, but it could be that, the bear eats a lot or the raccoon eats a lot and it poops somewhere in the riparian zone, and that fertilizes, the vegetation there. And there's actually been a bunch of science done on this subject, and we actually touch on it in our current Friends of Merrymeeting Bay newsletter, the winter edition 2019, which is on the website. In the West, where obviously you've got a lot of dead fish because the Pacific salmon are not repeat spawners as as Atlantic salmon are, and so they die, and there's a whole lot of dead fish around. And scientists have actually done, under some controlled situations, looked at fertilizer effects direct from the fish or from nutrients from scat, versus moving away from the riparian zone and comparing rates of growth in the forest. And the forest in that riparian zone really gets a boost from these migratory fish runs and the effects from that. Another really good effect is, speaking about dioxin and PCBs and the eels, it doesn't make the eels very healthy to eat, as you can imagine. A real benefit to the early season runs of alewives and to some extent the elvers, although they don't get that far, is that these are really clean fish. They're spending most of their time in the ocean. They're coming in to spawn, and they are being taken advantage of by the eagles here right during nesting time and the time when they raise their brood, so that the young are able to get clean, relatively contaminant-free food. So they get off to a good start, which is incredibly important, especially if you're a species trying to recover.
There are parts of what you're describing that seem almost idyllic.
It depends if you're the eagle or the alewife.
True. Yeah. And it also, it brings up the idea to me all the time. Every time I see these almost overabundance, though they're not, of bald eagles, and, people talk about them in Alaska as if they're almost like pigeons.
Sure.
The success of the Endangered Species Act is not to be understated. We really were worried very badly about losing that bird forever. Mm-hmm. That is probably one of the most important conservation acts we've ever passed.
It absolutely is, and unfortunately, as you well know, it often, a species often gets listed when it's too late. But there have been some really good, recovery success stories, and this is one. We actually were down to either no eagles or one eagle in the state of Maine. And we brought in a transplanted pair from Wisconsin, I believe, and it actually was brought into Merrymeeting Bay. One of the issues we've been working hard on the last few years has been on the Presumpscot River, which comes into Casco Bay, which is where Portland, Maine is. And it's only like a 25-mile long river, and it goes up to Sebago Lake. That 25-mile section has had like 8 dams on it for like 200 years, But in the 1880s, all of those dams had fish passage. And now, basically none of them do. And we've been working to try and restore fish in that watershed. And what's happened is the current first hydro dam owner has made arrangements with 2 quote conservation groups to take that dam down, which had needed to come down anyway because it's old and needs too much money put into it, and they couldn't afford probably fish passage. Because there's been a dam on site for like 200 years, the bedrock's been altered. So the consensus seems to be that just taking the dam down will not allow migratory fish to get up through there still. So they've got to do some sort of fish passage, and the license requires something. So these guys, the conservation groups, and I'll mention them, Conservation Law Foundation and Friends of Presumpscot River, basically met for 2 years with the paper mill company, South African Pulp and Paper. They said, okay, if you put in enhanced fish passage, better than the license requires, we will give you a quid pro quo of removing fish passage requirements at a couple of dams upstream for the length of their license. So the length of their license is another 34 years. So these two groups basically traded off the whole watershed for a few miles of habitat above this particular dam.
It's like they don't even know the history. David Brower's greatest regret.
Oh, I know.
It's like history repeating itself. It's identical to the Glen Canyon.
Yeah. And so where I was going with this was that talking about recovery of a species, that there's actually one dam below this one that's going to come out, but it's a non-hydro dam. And these same parties, or Friends of Presumpscot anyway, tried to do another deal on passage at this other dam a number of years ago, and we interfered and said, no, wait a minute. You're about to give away the rest of the watershed in exchange for, like you'll get a mile of habitat if they take this dam down. State of Maine actually has a non-hydro fishway proceeding where the state Inland Fisheries and Wildlife and Department of Marine Resources can, upon petition, institute a non-hydro proceeding that will require fish passage at the dam owner's expense. And why don't you try that instead? It's only been used like 8 times in our history. And that's what we ended up have happen. And so anyway, fish are coming up through this little lower spot. And so in the current proceeding, a lot of the talk about the justification for closing off passage upstream was, well, the fish just aren't going to be here in enough numbers, until those licenses expire anyway. After the dam owner got its okay to go ahead with this plan, which is just the beginning of this year, they finally released their passage numbers from the lower dam from last year, which in the last couple of years have been like 10,000 river herring or so. So they jumped up to 50,000 fish. So given enough of a remnant population and given access to habitat, these species can do an almost miraculous job at recovering. And the Endangered Species Act, if not invoked too late, can give them that opportunity. And when you've got situations like I just described, you're selling yourself short to underestimate the amount of time needed for a species to recover.
So for conservationists of all kinds, working on all kinds of issues, it's worth repeating that while you may be embroiled in a very, very long fight for something, you have to maintain a certain amount of perspective, even if you're just in the thick of it. Maybe you're in the middle of a 10-year battle, or whatever it's going to be, but you never know what you're giving away sometimes when you're making deals. And I can see how this happens. I've been in these battles. I've known lots more people who have, and much longer ones, that I can imagine it's easy to lose sight of, you're just working to get this thing you've told your supporters done. You want to get it done. You promise them, we're going to do this thing. And you get so myopic and, tunnel vision that you can make some really, on the outside 3,000-foot view, really bad decisions. With not probably darkness in your heart, just because you're on mission, you're focused. In one sense, that's a really good thing if you're going to try to do this kind of battle. It's hard, and the guys on the other side are going to try to throw you off in any way that they possibly can. You got to be sharp and you got to stay focused. But it's almost like groups need to hire minders, people who stay a little bit off to the side, or luckily have groups like yours who fulfill the same sort of mission and stop them when you see that kind of thing happening.
Well, and that's not to move away from the dams, at least just for a minute, or the fish just for a second. It's not a bad segue into what we do at Friends of Merrymeeting Bay and how unique we are in that we do really try and take a holistic approach to the environmental work we do, and we're doing a mix of research and advocacy and land conservation, land protection, and education. And the way we see it is it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to protect the fish if the water is polluted, right? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to protect the water if the land next to it is developed, or protect the land for nothing. So these things are all tied together. None of this is going to go forward if you're not working with the kids. For a lot of us that are working in the environmental area, or probably for that matter, any area, we often had a formative experience as a kid, right?
Right.
So, and I know I did, and I kind of know what it was, but we aim to do that with our kids, and so we actually happen to have a very active education program where we go into schools and talk about this stuff and bring in stuffed critters, taxidermy mounts, and then we have a couple of outdoor days where we get fourth graders from around the bay kind of out and getting their hands dirty and getting muddy and getting wet and doing real archaeology digs and making watershed models and taking different walks and beach seining for different fish and so forth. And we try and let our research inform our advocacy, because it's really important that whatever we advocate for, we have the facts on our side. But a colleague of mine who was an active fisheries biologist with the Department of Marine Resources just said to me the other day, I mean, we don't know jack. He was talking about something new he was learning about smelt, a rainbow smelt, which is a small fish that comes up here and people ice fish for in the wintertime, and they spawn in the late winter and the spring. And there can be landlocked smelt. I don't know if they were by bucket or by choice at some point, but this gentleman was running into smelt up in the First Fishway on the Kennebec, which is a long way from the ocean, and kind of wondering if maybe did these fish actually out migrate all the way anymore or not, and we just don't know. It's called a food web, it's not a linear diagram, it's pretty hard to often tell how one thing affects another thing.
But it really is an important point that you make. I mean, if you look over the landscape, the waterscape that you are on, and you have just described a biological richness that, you got to really write down fast all the species you talked about. You're just doing the tip of the iceberg stuff, right?
Right.
For us to make decisions on hydroelectric stuff or anything, we did it very, very prematurely. In every case, across the country, all of our developments and everything were completely not in consideration of what we would be doing to biodiversity and migratory patterns or anything like that. It's a really good point. And so I think people are starting to kind of realize we went right into rockets and smartphones and everything else and considered ourselves the top of the heap without really realizing. And you get into this discussion with oceans too, even more so, because we really don't have the capability technologically to even know that much about oceans yet. We put all of that kind of tech and everything into going to the moon and things like that. We haven't really explored our own planet.
Well, and I think we're in this sort of sixth grade extinction now. I don't remember the numbers, but we're seeing more critters have gone extinct here in the last 100 years than in a long time. And there's been a lot written lately about the great the insect apocalypse, and I talk about that a little bit in our new newsletter also. But and that's related to the diatoms, or the elvers or the little alewives. When you're talking about critters that are sort of towards the bottom of this food web, you are having an impact all the way on up through. Somewhere the other day, I just read something about, I saw someone testifying in Congress, one of the new Congress people, about the effects of offshore oil exploration and the sonic booms being used for that, low frequency sounds being emitted underwater. For that, and he was talking about the whales, which a lot of people have looked at, whales, dolphins, and marine mammal strandings, but there's really great science out of Eastern Canada that looks at these areas and finds that there's like a dramatic reduction in plankton in them after the sonic booms, after the sonic exploration, and a change in size of the plankton that are left. So here, like the eels, catching them as elvers, glass eels, and then killing them on their out migration as pregnant females, it's as someone around here said, you're eating your seed corn. That's probably what they say in the Midwest, right? So
Yeah, I've said that like 6 times today already.
okay, so yeah, so you're attacking. Bad enough you get the whales, then bad enough you get the diatoms or the phytoplankton, but man, you're getting both ends of the web. What's going to happen? It shouldn't take a genius to figure that out.
Right.
But we have, our perspective is pretty short term, and again, like touched on Hydro Quebec, out of sight, out of mind. Clean energy and hydro are not to be used in the same sentence. But it's different than looking out the window and seeing a smokestack belching smoke. But personally, having grown up and spent time in northern Quebec and paddled with the Cree Indians and seen that whole landscape go to pot, it's really, these things can have cultural impacts as well as environmental. And what happens? What do you see when you flick your light switch? Where's that energy coming from? It's coming from someplace.
Well, in your work with the kids, I kind of perked up when I heard that, because that's something of a theme that comes up quite often here when I'm talking to people from all over the place with all kinds of different backgrounds, and we end up talking about that. Do you think that it seems like with you at the helm, at least when you're around, kids are going to walk away with a little bit of a picture of what you just described in terms of a holistic look at everything, the inner workings, the webs, the linkages, and not just eels or just eagles, or just herring. But what kinds of things have you seen come out of that? What kinds of interests? I mean, some of those kids are certainly going to go on to be business people, and they'll be great donors to organizations that are doing this work. But other kids, how many of the other kids seem to be turned on and have a likely chance of going into the business, so to speak, of conservation?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and I really have no idea. In that it's not something that we, I wouldn't even know how to track that. We see them primarily at the elementary age. 4th grade is when kids here study quote main studies and looking at a lot of the environmental issues. So that's sort of the area we target. We get like 3rd to 5th graders. Sometimes we go to an older class. But what happens to those kids, I have no idea.
It'd be a great study.
Yeah, it would be a great study.
Because we have our anecdotal evidence. We've had our defining moments that you brought up earlier. I think everybody's got that story that rings the most true to them about when they were a kid and some kind of thing impacted them, an activity or a place or a thing or a creature or whatever, an encounter. And we know that to be true about ourselves, and we talk to each other, and we know it's true about most everybody we talk to are professionally or semi-professionally in the movement of some sort. So you got to have hope, right? It's like, okay,
absolutely.
So some of these kids, if you're providing possibly that seminal experience for a kid, that it could be the catalyst for those things down the line. It would really be interesting had somebody done a study already. Why hasn't anybody thought of this? Darn it.
Yeah, it would be great. And I don't know who does those kinds of things, but how to, obviously have to track, find out who was in school 15 years ago and came to Bay Day, and where are they now? And how do you figure that out?
Well, so you guys have that history.
There probably are some.
So Bay Day is what it's called, and you at least have that history in 15 years that you guys could do that. I wonder if somebody would fund just dripping through the records there and figuring out what kind of an impact in those terms do groups like yours have when you focus on kids and get them early and try to get them to have that big experience.
We go back probably about 20 years with this. So 4th grader is, how old? Like 9-10 years old, So they'd probably be about 30 or so now. And I don't know if that's too early to, be talking to them even or not. I will say that on our board, we do reserve a spot for a student. We don't have anyone here now, but over the years, we've had a couple of different like high school students on the board, and they have been probably better than any of the adult board members, in terms of their interest and just their enthusiasm, and it's been a real joy. And when a girl comes up to me during Bay Day and says, "I'm not going home, I want to be an archaeologist," after just getting done with the archaeology session, or "I'm not stopping for lunch, I want to be an archaeologist," or kids are all gathered around in a ball that looks like a tangled up, Medusa over a 5-gallon bucket or over a fish measuring board, trying to grab the little stickleback or mummy chug minnow, and measure it. They're going to go home with that,
Yeah.
and
It can't help but have an impact.
Yeah. So that's or they do, they hear about these anadromous migratory fish and then get to make fish prints, of alewives and of striped bass and so forth using our rubber. We got, a nice school of rubber anadromous fish that we made, and they can take that home and hang it on their wall or, in their classroom wall, or say in a school visit, when we're talking about these issues about fish passage, and say, well, how would you keep a fish from going into a dam, And, it's never more than about 30 seconds before a bunch of kids like, well, why don't we put a screen up in front of it, give them another way down. It's like, wow, bingo, you can be the next commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources. And, and the kids are saying, hey, what can we do? Can we write the governor? And okay, let's make a mural with fish prints on it and write messages on it and send it to Augusta,
Hey, that stuff works. It's proven time and again.
Yeah.
It's not only great for the kids and their experience and what they're going to do in the future, but it's also very effective. It works. A lot of people, even in the, people we might call enemies during a battle of some sort, not to excuse any really bad behavior, but they're just as myopic and tunnel vision in the promises they've made their constituents and their bosses and everyone else to get whatever job they are supposed to do done. And they can make bad decisions, and they get a fish print thing from a school and it can just set off a trigger. I've seen that happen. You have, I'm sure, countless times as well, where out of the blue, you thought somebody was never, ever going to even sit down with the likes of us. And then they start to respond. But thank you so much for being on Rewilding Earth. And everyone listening, you can go to friendsofmerrymeetingbay.org to find out more about what this great organization does and find out more about this wonderful watershed.
So this is a quote from one of our favorites, Edward Abbey. We're going to get their stinking dam. We've got secret plans. We're going to set up a laser beam below the dam, drill a tiny hole through the base of it. We've got underground chemists working on a formula for a new type of acid that will dissolve concrete underwater. We have suicide freaks from Stockholm and Tokyo who want to grow up to be human torpedoes. We've employed a crack team of serious Christians who are praying around the clock for an act of God. Long before it fills with mud, that Glen Canyon Dam is going to go.
I haven't heard that in a long time. Thank you so much, Ed.
Yeah. So we're still working on it. Thank you very much, Jack.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.